This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. At a rally in Las Vegas last month, President Trump spoke about the environment, something he rarely does, like he cared.
Remember this. I'm an environmentalist. I want crystal clean water. I want crystal clean air. That's what we want.
Putting aside the fact that his administration has gutted the Clean Power Plan, withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, and slashed the EPA's budget, is the president right? Do people want clean air and water? And more to the point, does the way they vote reflect that?
I'm a registered Republican. I'm conservative. I'm pro-gun. But I don't have a problem voting for a Democrat if he's on the right side of this issue.
Historically, polls have shown that environmentalists are not very good at voting. In the 2014 midterm election, of all registered voters, 44% showed up to the polls. That's compared with only 21% of registered voters who consider themselves environmentalists. So why are they so bad at voting, and will they turn out in the midterm elections? Nathaniel Stinnett has a plan for getting environmentalists to the polls on November 6th. He's founder of the non-partisan organization Environmental Voter Project, and he joins me now. Thanks for being here, Nathaniel.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Julie.
So let's start with that first question. Why are there so many self-described environmentalists who don't vote?
The truth is, we don't know all of the reasons why environmentalists aren't voting. Whatever stereotypes you might have in mind about what the typical environmentalist is, they probably aren't true. They are no longer the yuppie suburban who drives in a Prius and goes hiking on weekends. By and large, the people who are most likely to care deeply about climate and environmental issues are African American, Latino, live within 5 miles of an urban core, and make less than $50,000 a year. And so when you think about all of those demographic groups, they happen to be people who vote less often. But that's only part of what's going on. Because if you look within those demographic groups, if you look at Latinos, the people who care about the environment vote less often than the rest of Latinos. Or if you look just at African Americans, the African American environmentalists vote less often than other African Americans. So there's something else going on there. And the honest answer is, Julie, we don't know what it is. Because when you ask people why they're not voting, usually they lie. They say that they're voting, even though public records show that they're not.
So do you have any idea how many people we're talking about, how many non-voter environmentalists are actually out there?
Yes, we actually have a very good idea. In the 2014 midterm elections, 15.78 million environmentalists didn't show up on election day. All of these people were already registered to vote. They just didn't walk out their door on election day. And in 2016, for the presidential election, it wasn't much better. 10.1 million already registered environmentalists even stayed home for the presidential election, an election that was decided by a mere 77,000 votes. It's actually an enormous opportunity for the environmental movement because changing someone's mind about climate change or the environment is extraordinarily hard. But finding people who don't need to have their minds changed and just getting them out the door on election day, I won't claim that's easy, but it's a heck of a lot easier.
Ever since I learned about climate change, it's terrified me. But I'm not terrified any longer. This year, I'm a voter. I first became concerned about climate change when I learned that seas will rise 3 feet by 2050 because of climate change. And now we can do something about it to help solve the problem. This year, everyone that I know is a voter. Be heard. Be feared. Be a voter.
What happens when environmentalists don't vote? Are there implications you can put your finger on? And maybe you've already referenced one with the presidential race in 2016. But what would you say there?
There are enormous implications, and the obvious one is it impacts whom we elect. But I would say an even bigger implication is it directly impacts the policy that is made, not just on the federal level, but on the state and local level. And this is so important for your listeners to understand. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. And the first decision that any politician makes when they are running for office is they look at the public voter files and they say, with our limited time and limited money, who are we going to talk to and who are we not going to talk to? And they never, ever, ever waste any time talking to people who don't vote, which might sound cynical and surprising, but it shouldn't surprise us. I mean, why on earth would a politician care about the opinions of non-voters? We wouldn't expect Ford Motor Company to care about the opinions of 3-year-olds. I mean, 3-year-olds don't drive. And so when environmentalists don't show up, there is no reason on earth for politicians to prioritize our issues.
I understand the Environmental Voter Project is nonpartisan, but can you talk generally about how the environment is being talked about on the campaign trail, or maybe we should start with, is it being talked about?
It is. The environment is absolutely being talked about on the campaign trail. But what's important to understand is that it's only being talked about on the campaign trail in places where voters are demanding it.
Red tide and toxic algae continue to wreak havoc on Florida's marine life, especially in the Bay Area, and voters on both sides want a governor with a plan to help solve the problem.
Things like red tide.
In the Florida gubernatorial election, it's hard for Gillum or DeSantis to get 2 words out of their mouth without talking about blue-green algae or red tides or hurricanes or climate change.
Gillum making his case to supporters at a rally in West Palm Beach, laying out his plan to fix Florida's water issues.
I'm interested in making sure that we allow science and not politics to be our guide. And part of that means...
In poll after poll of voters, we are seeing these issues rise from the bottom to the middle to the top of voter concerns.
It is so specific to Florida. It is a really big deal. We need people in office that are going to help protect our environment for the future.
A really interesting thing happened in the gubernatorial debate in Florida just a few days ago. DeSantis, the Republican who was running, was asked about some of his potential sort of racial epithets that he had brought up. And then when his opponent, Gillum, responded to that, it was really interesting. He said, you know what? I'm black. I've been black my whole life.
I've been black all my life. So far as I know, I will die black. But this is the point. The only color that the people of the state of Florida care about is the blue-green algae flowing out of the east and the west side of this state. And they deserve a governor who is going to protect this environment after 20 years of environmental protection.
They also deserve a governor who will...
And that's amazing. I mean, the issue that was put in front of him had nothing to do with the environment. And he thought that the most politically shrewd way to deal with a question about race was to pivot and start talking about environmental issues. You hardly ever see that happen anywhere. But in Florida, where environmental issues are a really high voter priority, you see these politicians following. And we're seeing it in the North Carolina 9th District as well, where candidates are talking about Hurricane Florence. We're seeing it in Minnesota, where they're talking about mining near the boundary waters.
My parents taught me to love the outdoors. I camp and canoe with my family in Minnesota's Yellowstone, the boundary waters. So when President Trump tried to take away important environmental protections for the boundary waters, I said no way. I'm for mining, just not there. It's too special. Too important a place. I'm Eric Paulson, and I approve this message because I'll stand up to my party or President Trump.
Whenever environmental issues are a high voter priority, politicians will talk about it. And that's why it's so important for us to vote.
So where does the environment rank in terms of issues that voters say they care about?
It obviously depends on the election you're talking about. But as an example, we did a poll leading into the 2016 presidential election where we only polled people whose public voting histories showed that they were likely to vote in this election. It showed up as the 15th priority out of 19 issues for likely voters. Only 2% of voters listed climate or the environment as their number one priority, and another 2% listed it as their second priority. And that's very similar to a lot of the polling that we see now among likely voters for the 2018 midterm elections. For all of your listeners who were frustrated that climate change didn't come up in the presidential debates, this is why. This works for Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. And a perfect example was this past January. I don't think many people were surprised that Donald Trump didn't bring up climate change in the State of the Union. But you know what? Joe Kennedy didn't bring it up in the Democratic response to the State of the Union either.
I was going to ask, so how do you move that up then? How do you move an environment higher up on a list of issues that voters say they care about? How do you get it to be an issue that turns people out? You know, are hurricanes going to take care of that? Or is there some other way that you think will move that up that's less catastrophic?
That's a great question. And there are essentially three ways that it can happen. The first is what you alluded to. Mother Nature has a great ground game. She's good at get out the vote. And sometimes, as we are seeing in Florida and North Carolina and elsewhere, extreme weather and climate-fueled natural disasters turn environmental issues from being at the bottom of voters' priorities to being near the top.
Climate change nearly killed me and my family. That's why this year, I'm a voter.
When people are directly affected by the environment, then suddenly it pops up as an issue for them.
Hi, my name is Tony Love. In 2012, my family and I got hit by Hurricane Isaac. Fortunately, we made it out alive and we moved far away. But that move brought new concerns for me and my family. Now we're in California, dealing with all sorts of other climate-related issues.
Where environmental issues directly impact voters in a really profound way, it starts to become a more important priority. But we in the environmental movement don't want to just sit on our hands and hope that enough disasters will strike that people will start paying attention.
I'm tired of living in fear. We all know the risk, but it's not enough to talk about climate change amongst ourselves. We do have a solution. The solution is to vote. Here's the reality.
And so there are some other ways to increase the importance of environmental issues when voting. One way is just to try to persuade people to care more about these issues. That's really hard. And so the third approach is what we take at the Environmental Voter Project. What we've realized is the best way to get these people to vote is just to revert to fourth grade and use things like peer pressure and social pressure. It will sound very juvenile, but it's informed by some really good, sophisticated behavioral science. We say things like, hey, Julie, did you know last time there was an election, 93 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Another way that we do that is we will send a canvasser to your door, and we will simply ask you to sign a promise to vote. And then, right before the election, we'll not only mail it back to you, will remind you that you made a promise. And the reason that's so powerful is that almost every American, unless you're a sociopath, you want to be known as an honest promise keeper. And so simply reminding people that they made a promise, so much better at getting them to vote than trying to rationally convince them that they've got to show up on election day because they care about this issue or that issue. The truth is, talking about climate change is not a good way to get someone's butt out the door on election day.
And so you have canvassers who go up to people's doors. How do you know which doors to go to?
We are targeting 2.4 million non-voting and seldom voting environmentalists across 6 states: Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And before any canvasser shows up to their door or any volunteer texts or calls them, we know that they are super environmentalists, by which I mean they care so deeply about these issues that they list it as either their number 1 or number 2 priority, yet they're not voting. To be clear, we literally know who these people are by name and street address. And this is the same approach that big campaigns are taking.
Mm-hmm. You're not going up and down my street. You're going to a specific house on my street.
That's exactly right. Political campaigns don't target by demographic group anymore. Gone are the days when campaigns were focused on soccer moms or NASCAR dads or people like that. These campaigns have built predictive models, and they've assigned a score to every single person in the voter file, letting them know how likely you are to support a particular candidate or how likely you are to care about a particular issue. And so when we create our lists for our canvassers, yes, we say, go to Jane Smith's house at 127 Main Street because we think that she has a 92.7% likelihood of listing climate change as her top priority. And we know from her public voter files that she's an awful voter.
Are you getting any sense so far? Are early voting numbers giving you any insight of how things are looking for the midterms? Are environmentalists showing up?
We're starting to get some clues. The environmental movement is a very, very nuanced constituency. So it's dangerous to look at big demographic trends in early voting. However, let's get a little dangerous. Let's talk about it, and who knows what will happen. Maybe these trends will hold true. In 2017, we saw dramatic increases among youth voters, among young voters, Latinos, and African Americans. And these are all people who are overrepresented in the environmental movement. So that was a good sign. That was a good leading indicator for environmental voters. Early voting in 2018 so far, we're seeing some of the same trends. So we're certainly seeing higher than expected turnout among African Americans so far. And we're seeing slightly higher than expected turnout among young voters so far. However, we are not seeing an increase in turnout among Latinos, at least not yet. And so I think it's still to be determined whether we will have a dramatically higher turnout among environmentalists than we've seen in previous midterm elections. But the early data shows that we might, and that's good news.
So do you make predictions? What percentage of voters who claim to be environmentalists do you think might show up on November 6th?
You know, at the Environmental Voter Project, we're essentially data scientists and behavioral scientists. So I will never shoot from the gut. I almost always try to take a true, a scientifically rigorous approach to things. So as long as you understand that, this is just a guess and it's not based in anything, I think we're going to see a pretty dramatic increase in environmental turnout. And whereas in 2014, only 21% of environmentalists who were registered to vote showed up, I think we might get up into the high 20s. We might get 28, 29, maybe even 30% of environmentalists to show up. Because the truth is, we saw that in 2017. If we looked at 2017 and compared it to turnout in 2013 in places like Virginia or New Jersey, environmental turnout shot through the roof. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't expect that again this time around. So that's what I'm hoping for. But the proof will be in the pudding. We've got to see who shows up and votes on November 6th.
Well, Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Julie. Thank you so much for having me.
Nathaniel Stinnett is founder of the Environmental Voter Project. You can find more information about the project at our website, trumponearth.org. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast app and tell a friend about us. Our show is produced by Andy Cubis. I'm Julie Grant.